It's so easy to be average. It takes a little something to be special, doesn't it? It takes a little something special to be a great player. Did you push yourself to be great today?
This is the Silver Bullets podcast on the Ozone Radio Network, your authority on all things Ohio State. Buckeye Nation, welcome to the Silver Bullets podcast on the Ozone Radio Network. Today's show is episode 6, the Indiana Hoosiers preview. Pretenders or Contenders? I'm your host, Shannon Sommers, contributor at Hayes & Cannon at theozone.net, and producer of Acosta Field with Tony Gerdeman. Today, my co-host is none other than the Chip Minnick, who is also a contributor at Hayes & Cannon on theozone.net and Athlon Sports. Today, we will be previewing the Indiana Hoosiers, who the Ohio State Buckeyes opened the 2017 college football season with. We will also give some predictions, and we will have a question for our Ask the Silver Bullets segment. Joining the Silver Bullets podcast on the Ozone Radio Network is Zach Osterman from the IndyStar. He's a beat writer covering the Indiana Hoosiers. All right, Zach, thanks for joining us today to preview the Thursday night opener, which was pretty good for Ohio State because they have Oklahoma the following week, which gives them some extra time. But there's so many storylines, and one that I know new head coach Tom Allen is tired of discussing, and former head coach Kevin Wilson probably is too, but he's fortunate not to have to deal with the media as much as he used to. My question to you is, I hear fans saying Urban Meyer and Ohio State are terrible for hiring Wilson after his dismissal from Indiana. Is this a case where Indiana was being overprotective by relieving him? I ask because we know that the Buckeyes have a extreme vetting process, and if they go and hire someone with major issues, it'll bite the program badly since they have those two major NCAA black eyes. I mean, is this something that just they were trying to avoid a Tim Beckman situation, or was there actually a situation with Wilson?
Well, I mean, I think it's probably a little of both, and I say this sort of neither wanting to sound like I'm passing judgment on Kevin or defending him too much. Essentially what happened was there were concerns within the department at the highest level, I'm talking within the athletic director's office, about not necessarily the way injured players were being treated, not that players are being made to play through injuries or being, sort of abused in that way, but that Kevin Wilson had sort of fostered this culture wherein injuries were not just taboo, but something where injured players felt very belittled, felt very sort of ostracized, felt very devalued. And I think Indiana's point was not necessarily just that because every coach is, and I even remember talking to one of the former players or the parent of one of the former players who brought this up as everything happened with Kevin Wilson. And even he said, look, that there's, and I'm paraphrasing because it's obviously been several months, but that there's always going to be that line between tough and injured. And every coach has got to figure out a way to help their players understand what's hurt and what's an injury and those sorts of things. But there's got to be, you can only understand that up to a point. And I think that the feeling was that those lines were just being crossed too often. Now, Indiana actually kind of after some complaints, including that particular family, more or less did kind of a legal review or an audit of the whole situation, brought everything to Kevin Wilson, and Kevin agreed to kind of make some changes. And then there was a feeling, and what we've never really found out is what happened the second time. Something happened toward the end of last season that basically brought all these concerns back up and had Indiana departmentally again feeling like, whatever Kevin had agreed to, he wasn't holding up his end of the bargain with regard to the treatment of injured players and that sort of thing. So it's kind of a little bit of both, in the sense that I think there's certainly, particularly in this day and age, and in this climate of student athlete welfare and safety and all of the sort of awareness of that, it's something that Indiana is going to be very, very, sort of sensitive about. On the other hand, I also want to make it clear, Kevin Wilson wasn't, beating injured players. He wasn't forcing guys to play through broken limbs or anything like that. It was as much as anything, maybe a disagreement at an institutional level between the way that those sorts of players and that injuries in general should be handled between IU's athletic department or athletic director and his administration and Kevin Wilson. And at the end of the day, as much as anything else, and I think I said this a number of times back when it happened, if your boss tells you to do something and you don't comply, if that happened to me, I'd get fired. So it's kind of one of those where if you're Ohio State, I'm guessing, I could be wrong, but I'm guessing Kevin Wilson's not really setting the tone for the way that injuries or injured players are handled within the program. So it's not really something that could kind of extend itself into Columbus unless there's some unusual arrangement I'm aware of. It was more of kind of, I think, a difference of philosophies. And in fact, Fred Glass used that term, philosophical differences, over and over and over again in the press conference tonight that Kevin resigned and Tom Allen was hired.
Well, I'm glad you were able to put a lot of that to rest, especially for Buckeye fans and moving forward and everything. All right, speaking of Kevin Wilson, a lot of the media folks have asked what it's like coming from Indiana to Ohio State with the huge talent gap in the players. He actually takes major offense to this, and rightfully so. Is Indiana and Ohio State as big of a talent difference as some make it out to be, or do you think it's like his scheme and stuff like that?
Well, I think it's probably a little bit of both. I don't think anybody would ever kind of doubt that, the talent, that a talent gap is going to exist between Ohio State and Indiana. Ohio State is consistently one of the best recruited or best recruiting sort of forces year after year. It is consistently one of the programs that puts the most guys in the NFL. And, we can sit here and nitpick through recruiting rankings about guys that were misses or guys that were busts. But, if you just look at it statistically, the teams that excel at the highest level of college football and then probably just generally college sports are also nearly always the ones that consistently excel in recruiting. So there will always kind of be a talent gap there. Now, at the same time, I think to Kevin's credit, and probably what he's thinking about, is if you look at his time in Indiana, you look at his offenses. They set dozens of program records, but also look at the guys he had. Nate Sudfeld's in the NFL. Jordan Howard was NFC Offensive Player of the Year. I forget sometimes how they break those up nowadays, but Tevin Coleman was playing in the Super Bowl for the Falcons last February. Jason Spriggs and Dan Feeney are probably both going to be starters this year on their respective offensive lines. Cody Latimer's still in the league. There's probably at least 2 or 3 guys on this year's offense that'll wind up in the NFL, before it's all said and done. Wes Martin, Simmie Cobb, Nick Westbrook, some others maybe. So in that respect, I think that's probably kind of what Kevin's getting at, is between the sort of identification of talent in the recruiting process and then also development with Kevin and his staff, Indiana has plenty of NFL pedigree. And now that's just on offense. Defense is a little bit of a different story. And you can see that borne out, obviously, in the results that Indiana had at times one of the country's best offenses under Kevin Wilson, and too often one of the country's worst defenses. And that's borne out in terms of guys in the NFL as well. But, when Kevin talks about that, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I'd be guessing that's part of what he's talking about is, look, we weren't just a good offense for Indiana. These weren't just good players for Indiana. We had real talent, just kind of at a lot of different positions, particularly on offense during my 6 years there. And I don't think people should forget that. Right? That's what I get. That's what I'm guessing he's saying.
So one of the players you just mentioned, Simmie Cobb, are there any updates as to his status for the Ohio State-Indiana game? No, to be honest, and I don't think there will be, other than, when Kevin was in charge, you would never, because there'd always be off-season incidents. It's unavoidable when you got a roster of 125, 130 guys. And there would really never be any kind of notification of punishment or anything like that. It wouldn't be addressed very directly. Which is to say that it wouldn't be like Kevin would tell you exactly why each player was suspended. They just wouldn't be there. And if you didn't see them warming up and you asked about it, they'd say they are suspended for, the popular nomenclature of violations of team rules or not living up to team standards or whatever. My guess is Tom Allen is going to operate much the same way. And I would not be surprised if Simmie Cobb isn't suspended or punished at all in terms of like lost game time for what happened. And I'm not trying to, there's a lot of weird details in that particular incident and even more detail that we'll probably never know. So I'm not trying to, get too heavily into that specifically. And if he is suspended, whether it's for a quarter or a half or a game, I wouldn't be surprised because in the end he did get arrested. But I also wouldn't be surprised if Indiana looked at it and said, there's some mitigating circumstances here that probably mean, that the kid really doesn't deserve that kind of punishment. But one way or the other, I think we're just going to know when Simmie Cobb is either dressed out for warm-ups or isn't on Thursday night. So I really enjoyed your story in the IndyStar on the rise of Tom Allen, his rise through the coaching ranks. For those of our listeners who didn't have the opportunity to read the article, can you kind of the career path that Tom Allen has taken?
Well, it's been kind of a rapid rise. He started as a high school coach in Florida, moved pretty quickly to back to Indiana. Well, I don't say pretty quickly. I think he was down in Florida for 4 or 5 years. He actually coached. He was a head coach like right out of high school. Or excuse me, forgive me. He was a high school head coach right out of college. Then he moved to be defensive coordinator at Armwood High School. For anybody who's familiar with the Tampa area, Armwood is alongside kind of Plant and Largo and some of the better programs there. And then he and his wife wanted to move back to the Midwest, so he took a defensive coordinator job in Indiana. He's actually from Newcastle originally. He played for his dad at Newcastle High School. And he was at Marion for just 1 year. Then he went to Ben Davis, which is one of the sort of powerhouse programs in Indianapolis. He was a defense coordinator for 3 state title teams in 6 seasons at Ben Davis. He was a head coach for 3 seasons. After that, I think he won 3 sectional titles, if I'm not mistaken, in those 3 years. And then he broke into college at Wabash, which is a real small school in kind of northwest Indiana, sort of near Lafayette. He was only there for a year. Then he went to Lambeth for 2 years. Then he went to Drake for a year. Then he went to Arkansas State for a year. Then he followed Hugh Freeze to Ole Miss for 3 seasons as linebackers coach. Then after he helped Ole Miss build the number 1 scoring defense in the country in what it would have been 2014,
He got a defensive coordinator position at South Florida. He was only there for 1 year, and then he was in Indiana last season. So for a guy who is, only in his 40s, which is obviously, young by head coaching standards, even in college football today, he's put a lot of miles on his career. He's also a guy that was a high school coach, Tennesse. A decade ago, he was just starting his first college job, or at least his first college season. So he's not a guy who's got a ton of experience, but he is a guy that if you kind of track his career, he's had success, or the teams he's been with have had success just about everywhere he's been. I mean, even back to like his time at Marion. I know it's Indiana high school football, not the Big Ten, but I think he would have been at that point 27, 28 years old, maybe. Marion had gone 4-5 the year before, and they went 9-1 the year he was there, and they knocked something like 14 points per game off of their defensive average. So he's bounced around a lot. He's kind of moved a lot, but he's had success just about everywhere he's been too.
So speaking of defense, as somebody who's been a lifelong fan of Ohio State and can remember Indiana football through all the multiple coaching regimes through my lifetime, it seems strange to think that going into the 2017 season, that defense is actually the strength of this Indiana team. And considering Coach Allen, that's kind of his background, what do you anticipate the defensive philosophy going forward, not just for against Ohio State, but with this season?
Well, I don't think philosophy is going to change a lot. I think Indiana's still going to run the 4-2-5, which is what Allen installed last year. It is a fairly flexible defense. I mean, there were times where you might have thought you were looking at a 3-4 last season, not for extended periods, but Indiana, the point is Allen will move things around. He'll chop and change. It says 4-2-5, but he'll put a third linebacker on the field if he thinks it's necessary. But what I think he's looking for more than anything else from a schematic standpoint is, again, just that sort of versatility to be able to have a player like Marcelino Ball, who is, for all intents and purposes, a defensive back, but I think had 8 tackles for loss last season. To be able to try, or to be able to say, yes, we have a 4-man front, but every once in a while, we're only going to have 3 guys with their fingers in the ground. To be able to go from 5 defensive backs on one play to, 7 in the box, maybe even 8 in the box on the next play. And so I think it's going to be an aggressive defense. Indiana Indiana blitzed a fair amount last season, and I think they might do again this season. I think some of that's just down to the fact that their pass rush from their front four isn't quite where they want it to be, and that's been impacted somewhat by injuries. But it is a defense that kind of wants to play downhill, wants to attack. There's no question about that. But it's not one. I don't think you're going to see a massive change in sort of emphasis or philosophy. Tom Allen is still running the defense. He's still calling plays for the defense. I know Mark Hagan, his defensive line coach, is officially termed the assistant defensive coordinator, I think. But this is for all. Tom Allen is basically still Indiana's defensive coordinator as well as head coach. So on that side of the ball, I'm sure there'll be new wrinkles and things like that, but the basics probably will not have changed.
So considering the departure of Kevin Wilson, Mike Debord takes over as offensive coordinator. What kind of differences do you anticipate for Indiana coming forward this season under Mike Debord?
That's an interesting question. And, in one respect, we've had some of Indiana's more experienced offensive players more or less say that, the average fan probably won't notice a huge difference. The average fan will probably look at it and won't necessarily see a massively different setup, that the formations will look the same, that it's still kind of that hurry up offense. And you've still got a lot of the, you're still going to have a lot of the sort of basic emphases that you had under Kevin Wilson. But if you're asking, I think there will be some differences. I think number one, it would really not surprise me if Indiana ran the ball a lot less, or at very least if, I don't know how much you guys have studied or talked about Kevin Wilson's offenses, but for all of Kevin's talk of spread, no huddle, up tempo, go super fast, he ran the ball plenty. I mean, he wanted to run to set up the pass. He did it out of spread formations, shotgun, pistol, all that stuff. But he wanted to run the ball. I mean, and it's not a mistake that he had, 1,000-yard rushers and 4,000-yard rushers in the last 3 seasons. I don't know for sure that that's necessarily exactly what Tom Allen and Mike Debord have in mind. I mean, Allen calls Debord the head coach of his offense pretty much unreservedly. You look at what Debord did last season at Tennessee. His leading rusher was actually his quarterback, Josh Dobbs, and I think Dobbs had less than 900 yards rushing for the entire season. So it's not like Debord's offense at Tennessee last season was just all about sort of ground and pound by any means. And while Allen is leaving a lot of the offensive stuff up to Debord, there is also still, if I kind of go back to the way he talked about his offense before he hired an offense coordinator, it sounded to me then like he was talking about an offense that was more pass-based than what Kevin Wilson had done. And that sounds weird to say because Kevin Wilson's best offenses could pass the ball just fine. I mean, could be really prolific through the air. Nate Sudfeld is Indiana's all-time leading passer. But I wouldn't be surprised if you're going to see an offense that's just not so dedicated to the run, that asks running backs to be more flexible, more versatile, to be maybe a little bit more all action. I guess the popular term is all purpose back. It wouldn't surprise me if you see an offense that really wants those same things from its backs, that what you'd see at Ole Miss, what you saw last year at Tennessee, rather than what Kevin did. But I can't say that for sure because this staff has stayed pretty vanilla and pretty bland whenever we've had a chance to watch practice or the spring game or all that stuff. They're still installing, which you'd expect, and they're also trying to play a lot close to their vest, which you'd expect. So I think it's probably formationally going to look similar. Could be less running, but I also don't know that there's anything I'd stake my reputation to just yet because I don't think we've seen near the full Indiana offense yet.
So speaking of keeping it close to the vest, the running backs, is it going to be more by committee, versus, because you've referenced, Tevin Coleman, who Ohio State fans certainly remember Coleman running all over them in 2014 and, Divine Redding is it going to be more of that committee approach? Just kind of, like you said, just you think it's going to be more pass oriented, but just kind of until they kind of figure out maybe a, every down back, or what do you think going forward?
I think certainly to start with, it'll be by committee. And, I think that's going to include a lot of guys. I think it's going to include Mike Majette, who's probably RB1 right now. I mean, he's the one who's listed as the starter anyway, so you got to at least kind of go with that. I think Cole Guest, who Ohio fans might remember played at St. Edward, I think he'll be involved. I think you could even see, I think Devontae Williams will be involved. I think you could even see a guy like Morgan Ellison, who's a freshman from Ohio. I think he could be involved. I mean, he really had some impressive moments in fall camp. Now, again, I think what Indiana is looking for from that position is a level of flexibility and versatility. So maybe the best thing is to kind of keep that by committee approach all season. But I also wouldn't be surprised if one or two guys by, mid-season had kind of taken control of the position. I just don't think at the moment that Indiana's really comfortable. There's always kind of been, even irrespective of what Kevin wanted from the running game versus what, Tom Allen and Mike Debord want from the running game. There's always been, for the last 4 or 5 years at least, an heir apparent, that Kevin signed Stephen Houston as a JUCO transfer, and then Tevin Coleman almost immediately came in and kind of made it clear he was the next one to be coming through at running back. Then it was Jordan Howard behind him. Then it was Divine Redding behind him. There's not a guy like that on this roster. I mean, whatever anybody wants from that position, there is undoubtedly not a guy like that on this roster right now. So I think it wouldn't surprise me if somebody, whether it's Guest or Majette or somebody else, really kind of makes that position their own at some point. But I don't think anybody's done it yet. And so I think certainly at least for Thursday night, I lost track of what day of the week it was. I apologize. But I think certainly at least for Thursday night, you're going to see 4, 5 guys get carries. And it's going to be maybe less about trying to figure out who the best are than it is about trying to sort of put different guys in situations to capitalize on their strengths. But I do think you're going to see, a healthy amount of rotation at the same time.
Well, being an Ohio guy, I'm certainly rooting for Cole Guest. I just certainly hope he doesn't go off against Ohio State and have a career game or anything like that. So the last question I had before I turn it back to Shannon is Big Ten Network, watching the media days. I was very impressed with Coach Allen. He was very charismatic. He was very forthright about Ohio State coming into Indiana. This is the biggest home opener in the history of Indiana football. So my question is, are there any concerns either among the fan base, even I guess, among the coaches themselves, not that they would publicly say that, maybe there might be more emphasis on this game, that the idea that, maybe, putting so much stock and emphasis on Ohio State could possibly have, if things don't necessarily go well against Ohio State, that they could possibly have negative repercussions for Indiana's season after?
I don't know. It's always kind of hard to say how much one game could take out of, could take out of a team. But what's funny is I actually think that it's much more. I don't say much more. I mean, if Indiana could beat Ohio State, then in my mind, that's probably the most important game of the season for Indiana, because it would be such a big step. It would be a statement. Obviously, when was the last time Indiana beat a top 5 ranked team? Off the top of my head, I can't even tell you. So, it sort of goes without saying that if Indiana were to pull off the upset, and I'm not saying it would be easy, obviously, by any means, but if they were to pull off the upset, it would be, kind of the defining game of their season. But I actually think if they don't, even if they, come close or keep it tight, I kind of tend to think that the Virginia game in week 2 could be just as important, because Indiana's only got 6 home games this season, and it's 3 of its 4 in the Big Ten play are Ohio State, Michigan, and Wisconsin. So it's probably not one of those seasons where if you're Indiana, you say, okay, number one is to hold serve at home, and if we can do that, then we'll be fine. I think that if this team were able to get an early road result and just kind of say, okay, that's the formula, that's how we go away from Bloomington, out of Bloomington, and get the kind of result that we're looking for. When you've got road games, not just against Virginia, but also Michigan State, Maryland, Purdue, Illinois, I think that could be, frankly, a really big step for Indiana all its own. So, would this game specifically take too much out of them? I guess we could sit here later in the season and maybe say, yes. I don't think so. If anything, I actually think that week 2 against Virginia could be just as important, if not more important, for Indiana than Ohio State in some respects.
We mentioned about the defense. You look at basically what's returning for Indiana. It's like 98% of their defense, and I think it's like best in the nation. Their secondary and their linebacker core is extremely solid, maybe probably closer towards the top of the league. But you look at their defensive line, and it has its issues. When you see an Ohio State team with an offensive line that's bigger than like the Cleveland Browns, how do you approach that? Or how do you think the team approaches that in order to try to get an advantage?
I don't know if they'll worry about it too much, frankly. I think even Indiana at some level would tell you that defensive line is the biggest question mark that this defense has. It's kind of the one place where you maybe don't have those dedicated stars the way you have Tigray Scales or Rashard Fant or whoever. At the same time, it was kind of that way last year. It was pretty similar last season, and it forgive me, I'm trying to remember the stats. I think it was 24 sacks and 71 tackles for loss in the last 7 games of the season. So the line play kind of started off slow, undoubtedly, but really did step up as the season wore on. And that was without, again, any real dedicated sort of obvious stars. I think, to some extent, look, again, when you talk about the talent gap between an Indiana and an Ohio State, part of it is not necessarily just those starters, but it's that if a guy gets hurt or if a guy needs to be rotated out for a few plays because he's just fatigued, the guy behind him is probably more talented or just, sort of physically gifted for Ohio State. Ohio State's backups are going to be a little bit better than Indiana's backups. That's part of that talent gap, I think. But this is also a defensive line it's not like they've lost a lot from last season. They've lost a couple key guys, including one to injury. I think Niall Sykes could have been sort of that dedicated pass rush specialist for them. But this wasn't a group that was just packed with stars last season, and that's why they did well. It was a group that figured out how to sort of be more than just the sum of its parts. And that's what they're going to have to do again this year. Obviously, Ohio State's a big first test. But it's also, I don't think they're going to be overawed by it or anything.
Speaking of the defensive line, talk about the Ohio State's defensive line matching up against Indiana's offensive line. I believe there's replacing 3 guys on the line for Indiana. What kind of matchup problems do you foresee there, especially when there's a great possibility that they're looking at facing the best defensive line in the country tomorrow night?
Yeah, if anything, I'm more curious to see how that goes, than Indiana's defensive line against Ohio State's offensive line. And I'm not trying to be flippant. I'm not saying Indiana's defensive line is just going to cut off, Ohio State to shreds or anything. But IU's offensive line is talented, but it's also very young. There are no seniors in that group. There's only, I think, 2 redshirt juniors. It's a line that's lost a lot over the last 2 seasons. Jason Spriggs, Dan Feeney, Jake Reed, Demetric Camille, Wes Rogers, Jacob Bailey. A lot of experienced guys, a lot of talented guys, so a couple in the NFL. And again, I think both Spriggs and Feeney at this point, I think, are likely to be starting for their teams week 1. Now, Indiana's still got, I think, some talent there. I think Wes Martin is probably one of the most unheralded offensive linemen in the league in the Big Ten right now. Coy Cronk was a true freshman All-American at left tackle last season. Delroy Baker's a 4th-year player at right tackle, and eventually they should get Brandon Knight back to kind of give him some competition there, though I don't think Brandon Knight will be anywhere near playing Thursday night. I'm sure he'll come out and start first series, and I'll look really stupid for saying that, but I don't think he's going to be available for Thursday. And then beyond that, you got guys redshirt freshmen, redshirt sophomores, guys who've lived in spurts, as subs or rotational guys, but haven't, been full-time starters, I suppose you'd say, at any point in their career. So it's a young group. I think it's a talented group, but I also wouldn't be surprised if it's a group that needs a little while to find its feet. The problem, as you point out rightly, is this is an incredibly talented Ohio State offensive line. I mean, I saw what Greg Schiano said, just like everybody else. And when Ohio State is impressed with its offensive or with its defensive line, that says something, because it's obviously a program that's turned out a number of really talented defensive linemen through the years. That this group seems to be even a cut above that is naturally going to turn heads, and is going to be a really big test for Indiana's offensive line on Thursday night. And I think if I'm looking at kind of one position group to really evaluate in this game, it's that front five for Indiana, or maybe even front six in some cases, depending on what they do with the tight end position, because on one hand, it's going to be a really tough task. On the other, if they can stand up to it a little bit, then I think that bodes really well for Indiana going forward through the rest of the schedule, because I don't think you're going to see another defensive line that's nearly this talented, with all respect to some of the other really good teams Indiana has on its schedule.
Now, with that being said, you look at Indiana, and they've got one of the top wide receiver tight end groups in the Big Ten. Do you think one of the biggest keys for them to be successful is the quick passes in order to try to keep that speed at bay for the Buckeyes?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. And yet at the same time, I think Indiana is just, again, kind of going back to that long, a lot of these are long rambling answers. A lot of my answers are always long rambling answers, but kind of going back to that conversation about the running game and what to expect, differences in IU's offense. I think Indiana might just want to pass the ball more as a general rule. I think Indiana wants its tight end to be more involved than it's been the last couple of years in the passing game. I think you're going to see, one of the things Kevin Wilson really loved was those small, nimble slot receivers. You see Shane Wynn, who's with the Jaguars now. I mean, heck, Mitchell Page was a 5'9" walk-on from a small mid-sized Catholic school in Indianapolis, and now it looks like he might actually make the Chargers 53-man roster, or at worst be a practice squad player. I think Indiana is going to go with bigger bodies a lot. Now, not always. You're still going to see some Jay-Shun Harris, some Isaac James here and there. But don't be surprised if you see Indiana come out with some sets where they got three wide receivers across the field and they go like 6'3", 6'4", 6'3". I think you're going to see a lot of that too. And so I think it's, Indiana might try to use some of that short passing stuff to maybe in lieu of a run game to negate that pass rush a little bit and kind of open things up downfield. But I also just think that that's to some degree what Indiana is going to want to do this season, not just against Ohio State, if that makes sense.
When you look at the Big Ten East, you have pretty much the big three with, depending on how Michigan State fares out, kind of right there. But you look at these three or four programs, and one of the biggest things about these programs is the talent that they have in the trenches. Is this something that Tom Allen has stated that he's definitely trying to focus more on as far as recruiting going forward?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think any defensive coordinator is going to want to start up front, but I think Tom Allen is, like so many coaches, very much a proponent of the idea that games are won and lost first along the line of scrimmage. And, one of the, I don't know how much y'all have talked to or heard from Kevin Wilson or anything like that, but Kevin was actually is full of these really like sort of short, blunt, but very kind of charming and on-point statements about football. And one of the ones that always stuck with me that he used to say is, he'd say people always ask about our offense. Are we a run offense? Are we a pass offense? Whatever. He'd say your offense is what you can block. And it doesn't matter what you want to do. Your offense is what you can realistically block consistently. And I think the flip side of that is your defense is what you can prevent an offense from blocking. And so I think Tom Allen is very much a proponent of that. I think as much as, there's so much focus on the defensive backfield. And I think part of that is Indiana's returning all of its starters there from last season. And a couple of those starters may have lost their jobs in the preseason because other guys just stepped up and performed. And then B, it is a 4-2-5 defense. So you're thinking, wow, there's that extra defensive back. This must be a real sort of pass defense oriented kind of scheme. But I think Tom Allen is all about that front seven just as much as anybody else, on defense. And I think he's just as much about making sure he's got stout, aggressive linemen and really smart, tough linebackers. And that his defense has got to start there as much as anywhere else. So, yeah, I think line plays can be really important on both sides of the ball. I think it always is. And I don't think Tom Allen is going to be trying to reinvent the wheel in that way. I think he believes that just as much as anybody else.
Now, before we ask you your thoughts of the game, I just want to take a moment while we have everybody here. And with everything that's going on down in Texas, because we have a family member of ours who's a member of our Ozone Radio Network, and I'm sure fans from Indiana know people down there or have family and stuff. I just want to suggest that if our listeners from Indiana could text Red Cross to 90999 and help out. I can't even put into words what's going on because the pictures just don't do it justice. I don't know if you have any thoughts or anything, as far as like Salvation Army or anything. I know Ohio State announced that they're donating $10,000 in the basketball program, sending shirts and shoes and stuff like that. Because, Houston coach Sampson was asking for that. So I don't know if, anything is planned for Indiana.
Yeah, I don't know. I know that there's going to be, I think both teams, I just saw this today, are going to wear stickers on their helmets, sort of calling for awareness and fundraising. My aunt and uncle, my mom's sister and her family live in Conroe, which is about 30-40 minutes north of Houston. They're doing okay. We've been checking in with them kind of all week, and it's been scary for us, as I'm sure it's been for, literally millions of people around the country. I don't know if Indiana's involved directly in anything. I've kind of poked around. I haven't gotten any word yet, but it is early. And I think what occurs to me is, it's always good to donate to the Red Cross. I think it's also always good. You always want to make sure, you always want to verify that you're donating to some place that, is legitimate and all that. Yeah. I think it's always good too, to try and donate as directly as you can. You know what I mean? Like find if there's kind of boots on the ground places, that you can go to that can, that are going straight into the communities that are affected. But, unfortunately, I think we're also going to need some dust to settle before we can know exactly who needs what, because it's unfortunately still such an ongoing situation in a lot of ways.
Yeah. It just made landfall again today. So it like I said, it's just mind boggling when you sit there and hear 40 inches of, rain fell or more. It just, you can't comprehend it. The human mind doesn't let you actually put it into, perspective to understand it. With that being said,
it's difficult to watch.
Yeah. What are your thoughts of the outcome? Not really prediction, but just as far as play from Indiana. I know that they're going to come out hot, heavy. They're going to come out charged. I retweeted something that one of your columnists wrote today, and I gotta, it was pretty on point as far as the electricity in the air and how big this is going to be for Indiana and the fans and everything. I think they're going to start opening up the tailgating lots at 8 a.m. So, the players are going to be all hyped up. What are you expecting?
I think it's, I would be. It sort of feels like it's skirting that line between just that perfect atmosphere. No, I want to say, when I say perfect atmosphere for an upset, that doesn't mean I'm predicting one. It just means that it's creating those conditions that where like the number 2 team in the country has to go on the road, and a team like Indiana can maybe close that gap a little bit. But it feels like it's sort of skirting the line between that and almost this sort of like Tyson Spinks scenario where it's just getting played up and played up and played up and played up. And then, you know, it winds up just kind of being deflating in the end. And it could be, I mean, it really well could be coaches and players are going to talk about focus and maintaining it and all that. It really well could be that one of Indiana's biggest tasks tomorrow is simply avoiding being overawed by all of it and sort of swept up in the emotion of all of it. There's going to be a special anthem singer. They're honoring Lee Corso. There's going to be a military flyover. Game days in town. It's, you know, it is frankly unlike just about anything Indiana football's seen in at least the last 30 years, probably well beyond that. So I think it's going to be a good atmosphere. You know, it cautiously, you know, because the sort of rueful joke that Indiana fans love to tell about IU Ohio State games in Bloomington is that that's when Indiana takes the aerial shots of the stadium because everybody's wearing red and it's always full. And of course that means there's a ton of Ohio State fans in town. I think cautiously IU folks I've talked to, I mean, within like kind of the department and around this game, think that the IU Ohio State fan ratios, which probably go 60-40, 65-35 a lot of the time, may be a little bit more heavily in IU's favor, and that could help. But I do think it's going to be a great atmosphere, and I'm just, from a neutral's point of view, because obviously I'm not paid to care who wins specifically. I'm just hopeful that it lives up to it and that, you know, we get a game that can match kind of all this, because I know Bloomington is really excited to see this come through, and I just think it'd be fun, you know, as somebody who is a sort of, you know, professional surveyor of college sports, I suppose. It'd be fun to see the game live up to the hype and the atmosphere. Those are often just the best ones to me.
I agree. Well, Zach, we want to thank you for coming on and joining us. You want to go ahead and give our listeners where they can find you at on Twitter, to follow you, get the good information, where they can find your work at?
Just IndyStar.com, INDYStar.com, /sports. I guess if you want to do it specifically, it's /sports/Hoosiers, but usually /sports is good enough. And then at Zach Osterman, just my name is my Twitter bio. So should be fun. This is kind of the beginning of the 9 months every year where I just put my head down and look up again in April and breathe. But it's wouldn't have it any other way.
I hear it. Just make sure all the listeners that are enjoying the show, you eat plenty of your smoked turkey bones while you're tailgating, and so that way you get to stay up late and enjoy the game.
Well, you know, the funny thing is, I haven't been to an IU football game, not in a professional capacity, in years. I went to IU. For a long time, they had a foot-long hot dog that was probably actually more like 14 or 15 inches. It was only $5. And it was like the only concession that I'd ever bought at like a major sporting event that seemed worth the money. So if you can put down, 14 inches of hot dog, or if you want to split it with your family or something, that's usually what I recommend to people. But I can also not guarantee you they're still selling those, because I have not paid for a ticket for an IU football game in many, many years.
Well, that sounds like it'd be up there with the Fat Doug over at Rutgers.
What's that? Oh, is that the burger? Like the?
No, it's I think it's like chicken tenders with mozzarella sticks on it. Yeah, it's really good.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about now. Yeah, it's not a burger, but like a sandwich.
Yeah.
It's perfectly healthy, of course.
Oh, yeah. Well, because, while you're tailgating, that's all you got to do is you're all about the healthy foods while you're tailgating.
Exactly.
Right.
That's why you have that's why you've got the vegetable plate there.
Yeah,
so
to offset everything.
The broccoli and the cauliflower going into. There's a friend of mine. I still will, if my friends are doing tailgates or things, I'll just stop in and say hi on the way to the press box because people come into town, and it's always fun, good collegial atmosphere on game days. And I got a buddy who makes this chicken cheese dip that I think it's basically just like cream cheese, like baked chicken shredded, and then like buffalo sauce. And it's so good.
That stuff is. I know exactly what you're talking about. I make that a lot. Yeah,
and it's like a sixth sense I had. Anytime Alan brings down his chicken cheese dip, I somehow hone in on his tailgate on my way to the press box.
Nice. All right, like I said, we want to thank you for coming on and taking the time out.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
One is a riverboat gambler using his gut to make his picks. The other is cool, calculating, and scares Vegas. This is the Silver Bullets game prediction segment. Who are you going to ride with? All right, now it's time for our prediction segment where we know that basically I just pick a team and don't even think it through, and 9 times out of 10 I'm wrong, but somehow even after Chip does all his research and grinding and his Vegas odds, I only end up like maybe 5 games away in the finals. Let's kick it off with some Big Ten play on Thursday night. So Ohio State's not the only Big Ten team that has any battles. Buffalo goes to Minnesota. PJ Fleck in his first game for rowing the boat at 7 p.m. on BTN. Who are you taking in this one?
I'm taking Minnesota. I think the enthusiasm of PJ Fleck will be too much for Buffalo on Thursday night.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not sure exactly who all Buffalo has, but they don't have, the MAC and all that when they played Ohio State. So I'm definitely going to be going with Minnesota on this one. I think PJ Fleck is going to be a great, coach, and watching that series on BTN, you kind of opened your eyes up about a lot of stuff. The other game that's going to be challenging the Buffalo at Minnesota, which is 8 p.m. on ESPN, is the Ohio State Indiana. Who are you taking in this one?
You really have to ask, but I'm going to go with Ohio State. Do you want the final score prediction, or do you want that later?
Yeah, you can give a final score prediction.
I'm going to go with 38-17. I think Indiana will play Ohio State tough for at least the first half, maybe into the third quarter. But I just think Ohio State has too much depth, too much speed. And I think what we'll see in the second half, Ohio State will pull away. But I believe that Indiana will play very, very well and will be well positioned to have a successful 2017 season under Tom Allen.
So you're going for the same score as last year. I'm going to go with the Buckeyes,
I guess,
also.
But
yeah,
I never thought about it from the perspective of last year's score. I just look at it from, because I've written about it for on Hayes and Cannon, and I also have an article out on Athlon Sports, kind of keep an eye out for. So I would appreciate any of our loyal listeners to go to either Hayes and Cannon or Athlon.sports for those articles I've written. But yeah, I think Indiana has the talent to keep pace and frustrate Ohio State, depending on some of the things that I predicted. I'm not saying that all of my predictions are going to come true based on without seeing Ohio State or Indiana to this point. But yeah, I think Indiana can keep pace for about a half, and I'll go with 38-17.
I'm actually going to go with 42-7. And the only reason I'm going that much is, one, Kevin Wilson's running a different offense. This offense is no longer going to be they adjust to the defense. They are going to be aggressive and make defenses adjust to them. You look at Ohio State's offensive line compared to Ohio State's defensive line to Indiana's offensive line, and vice versa. And Ohio State wins the battle of the trenches. And I think that part of the game gets really ugly, and it's going to create a lot of issues for Indiana. Next, let's go with the Friday night matchup. We have a couple of Big Ten teams that are playing here. Number 8, Washington, goes to the birthplace of college football at Rutgers at 8 p.m. on FSN or FS1. Who are you taking in this one?
You just used the term really ugly, so I'm going to borrow that, and I think Washington's going to just steamroll Rutgers again.
And I'll tell you what, if Washington doesn't, then they're going to be really hurting in the Pac-12 there. I'm going with Washington also. Next up, you have Utah State at number 9, Wisconsin, 9 p.m. on ESPN.
I'm going to go with Wisconsin here. I think Wisconsin, we talked about it previously. I think Wisconsin is going to have a very successful 2017 season. I think this is just the first step in that successful season.
I agree. And Badgers, can you stop with the injuries to the linebacker core, please? Because, we picked you guys to win the Big Ten East, so these injuries to the linebacker core are not helping at all. Let's move on to Saturday. Akron at number 6, Penn State. It's a 12 p.m. ABC game. Isn't Tommy Tuberville still coaching for Akron?
No, you mean...
not Tommy Tuberville, but...
You're thinking of... now you got me.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. I'm no good with names.
But yeah, anyway, it is Penn State's going to roll here. I think this is the stereotypical early season tune-up game. So Penn State's going to. I think you're looking at like a 56-7 type Penn State.
Yeah, that one should be pretty ugly. Get to see Saquon Barkley and Trace McSorley and everything, how that offense is going to go.
The name just came to me, by the way. You're thinking of Terry Bowden.
That's it.
That's who you're thinking of.
You're right. Next up, Maryland. I think this matchup's going to be pretty decent. Maryland at number 23, Texas, 12 p.m. FS1. DJ Durkin and Tom Herman battling. Go ahead. Who are you going to take?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm going with Tom Herman. I think Texas is going to. I think Texas will have this. I think they're ready to roll under Tom Herman. I think Maryland. This is going to be one of these games they're going to look back on and say, why didn't we schedule Little Sisters of the Poor or Cupcake Stage or something like that? Because this might be one of the games that keeps them out of a bowl game.
Yeah, I think Texas has a talent there. So with the offense, I think Durkin's more of a defensive coordinator and Herman's a offensive coordinator. So it's going to be a battle of offensive defense. But I think Texas has, just based on it's Texas, they have the better athletes, the better recruits. Even though they had Charlie Strong, it just didn't work out. But he was building the program back up. This is going to be the barn burner here. Number 11, the Highlighters, at number 17, Florida. And I say Highlighters because I don't know if you've seen their uniforms that they're going to wear. This game's going to be in Dallas. It's going to be Michigan against Florida, a rematch of the 2015 bowl game, 3:30 p.m. on ABC.
Well, I'm going to watch it. It's just I agree with our esteemed colleague Tony Gerdeman. I think it'll be very nice for Michigan to wear West Virginia's uniforms before West Virginia has to play. Get them washed and cleaned. But getting back to the question at hand, interested in watching this because we talked about this before on a previous podcast that with Michigan having lost so much talent and, some of the concerns that I would have about, Michigan's offensive line and the inexperience on the defense, but when you're going up against a Florida team is on the defensive side of the ball. So I think it's going to be low scoring. I'm going to go with Michigan simply because for as inexperienced as Michigan is, I think Michigan's talent, although it's inexperienced, is going to be enough to compensate against what has been a woeful Florida offense for the last several years. So I'm going to go with Michigan, but I don't look for it to be high scoring. I look for it to be very, very close.
When I look at these uniforms, like you were saying, letting them wear the West Virginia uniforms first, first thing I think is Minions. But with everything that's going on with Florida, 8 suspensions, I believe now, if Michigan does not beat Florida, they're going to have an extremely long season. But I'm going to take Michigan in this game. I originally was going to take Florida because I thought maybe they might have had better athletes and whatnot, and defensively they're a little bit more proven than what Michigan is right now, even though Michigan has Don Brown and he has to have that respect. But I just think the 8 suspensions and all that turmoil, that's just a lot of stupid stuff going down in Florida right now. All right, at 7:30 p.m. on Fox, you've got number 16 Louisville and the Heisman Trophy winner against Purdue. Who are you taking on this one?
Louisville. I think it should be interesting because Bobby Petrino is well respected as an offensive mind, and Jeff Brom is also kind of in that. I don't want to say. I'm not saying he's tremendously as innovative as some other people, but his offenses have always been productive. So I'm looking at this as more of a shootout, and Louisville having more speed and more talent than Purdue does at this time. But I think it should be an entertaining game for those people who like offense. I'm going to go with Louisville.
Yeah, I definitely agree. The matchup where I know a lot of people are probably upset, and ESPN was desperately trying, you could tell by their poll, trying to put number 1 and number 2. You've got number 3 Florida State going at number 1 Alabama and Atlanta, Georgia, 8 p.m. on ABC. This one's going to be a pretty good game. With Seminoles coming back and beating Michigan last year and Alabama losing to Clemson in a national championship game, who are you going to take?
This is a tough one to pick. I'm going with Alabama simply because even with all the turnover that the Crimson Tide have year after year, all that Nick Saban has been recruiting at such a high level that the talent that is coming up, not necessarily experienced, is equally as talented. And Florida State, their offensive line was probably, I don't want to say the major weak link, but one of the weaker areas on the team. And I just think that's going to make the difference. I look for Alabama's defense to be able, against Florida State, to keep the Crimson Tide in the game. So I'm going to go with Alabama in a close one here.
Yeah, I think Hurts this is going to be his coming out party. He's going to limit his mistakes. And I think he's going to have Alabama prevail. So I'm going to go with Roll Tide on this one. Let's move to Sunday. It's a top 25 matchup. Number 22 West Virginia at number 21 Virginia Tech, 7:30 on ABC.
Tough one to call, but I'm going to go with Virginia Tech here. I think Virginia Tech, they're making that transition still from Beamer ball, to Justin Fuente, and he had a very successful first year. I just think Virginia Tech, I'm going to go with them. Don't ask me in terms of, what's the strengths or the weaknesses, because none of us have seen anyone play yet, which is always the folly of college football polls at this part of the season. But question at hand, I'm just going to go with Virginia Tech on just kind of more of a gut instinct than anything else.
I'm going to go with West Virginia myself. I like to see Virginia Tech win, but I just I don't know. My gut's telling me West Virginia, and we know how my gut goes, so I'll probably go at least one game down now. Monday night, number 25 Tennessee at Georgia Tech. It's 8 p.m. on ESPN. It's the last game of the weekend, closing up the first week of the college football.
I always like watching Georgia Tech or Navy or, Army's coming up in a few weeks. Any of these teams that run the offenses, I just think it is, demands respect, because you can be, you may not have necessarily the physical talent of your opponent, but it's going to make your opponent play, every player on the team, it's truly 11 on 11 football. That being said, Butch Jones is probably sitting on one of the hotter seats in college football. Again, I'm just going to go with Tennessee. I think they have a little bit more speed, but it wouldn't surprise me if Georgia Tech pulls this one out. So I'm going to go with the Vols, but I'm far from certain on it.
I'm not impressed with Tennessee. Not impressed with Jones as their coach. I'm going to go with Georgia Tech. I think they pulled the upset. Now it is time for the Ask Silver Bullets segment. This is your time to be a part of the show. All right, so we're going to have a Ask the Silver Bullets segment on our show. There's different ways that you're going to be able to send in questions if you like. You can use the hashtag AskSilverBullets on Twitter. You can @ us, SILVR Bullet Pod. You can like us on, or follow us on Twitter. On Facebook, if you like our Silver Bullets podcast page, you can leave a comment or send us a message. You could email us at silverbulletspodcast@gmail.com. And something new we're going to try this year is we're going to try a call-in, leave a voicemail, and we'll play your voice, if you like, on our show and answer your question. The call-in number is area code 567-203-5705. First question we have for the show is from Race Fan Geo. J.K. Dobbins getting more carries than Weber in week 1.
I believe that's going to be the case. Mike Weber is nursing a hamstring injury, and even though I look for Mike Weber to start, I'm sure that the Ohio State coaches are going to be very, very cautious in overusing Mike Weber, because the last thing in the world they want to, or an extended period of time. So, yes, I do believe J.K. Dobbins more against Indiana than Mike Weber.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely can see that happening, especially if you see Ohio State's offensive line taking control of Indiana's defensive line and creating big holes for Weber, and you start seeing a lot of separation point-wise on the board, because they need Weber for more than just the Indiana game. And you might even see a lot of, depending on how everything goes, but you might even see McCall or Antonio Williams out of the backfield a lot, getting some carries too. So it wouldn't surprise me. All right, that's going to do it for today's show. We want to thank Zach Osterman of the IndyStar for joining us to preview the upcoming game. You can find Zach's work at IndyStar.com, and you can follow him on Twitter at Zach Osterman. You can find Chip Minnick on Twitter at Chip Minnick, MINNICH, and his work at Hayes and Cannon on the Ozone.net and Athlon Sports. You can follow me, Shannon Sommers, on Twitter at Shannon CFB, and my work at Hayes and Cannon on the Ozone.net. Also, you can hear me on Acosta Field with Tony Gerdeman on the Ozone Radio Network. Don't forget to subscribe to our show on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play, and YouTube. You can also find our show on theozone.net, as we are a part of the Ozone Radio Network, with other great shows like Sons of Schmidt with hosts Mike Meals and Brandon Zimmerman. Oh, Hail No with hosts Joe Dexter and Claire Crawford. And The Anchor across the field with Tony Gerdeman. For Chip Minnick, I'm Shannon Sommers saying thank you for listening and go Bucks.
Go Bucks.